I worked with Martin Gilead to put this list together. It's by no means comprehensive, but a good introduction to the things you might want to think about, and noting that understanding them is the first step in overcoming each of these barriers. I'm going to start by identifying how individual personality can impose a barrier to creativity. First, there is the notion of functional fixedness, or only seeing the obvious way to solve a problem. If you looked into a particular way of doing something or a habit, it's very difficult to come up with new creative solutions. This is especially the case if you lack flexibility and only see one right way of solving a problem. The next barrier is self-censorship. This is the inner voice that holds you back and tries to prevent you making a fool of yourself. A third barrier to creativity is micromanagement. This is the tendency to require or look at too much detail in relation to the problem. We often use the expression, "cannot see the forest for the trees," to describe this problem. Overthinking is another barrier to creativity. And overthinking a problem relies on using the logical conscious side of our mind, our left brain, while creativity often comes from the right brain, our subconscious mind, that can link together unrelated ideas. Creativity myths can also act as a barrier to creativity. For example, the idea that only creative people have creative ideas, and that creativity cannot be learned. As a professor teaching a course on creativity, I certainly hope that's not the case. In fact, I can assure you it's not. Another barrier is risks. This involves the fear that people will have a negative impression of them for suggesting an idea, which encourages them from proposing it in the first place and from upsetting the status quo. This also stifles creativity. Another barrier to creativity is often seen as the lack of time or opportunity. People often feel that they're too busy with their day-to-day efforts to have time to focus on being creative. It's important that you are well rested and have enough sleep so that you're at your creative best. Lastly, note that criticism or rejection by negative thinkers can put you off from proceeding any further with your ideas. While constructive criticism can be a valuable tool in improving your idea, as we'll discuss in a later session, when we introduce Alex Bruton's big idea, which starts with the assertion that your initial idea probably sucks. An important personality trait that can create barriers to creativity is motivation, or the lack of it. A lack of intrinsic or extrinsic motivation will stifle creativity. This can be caused by laziness or a lack of curiosity, or simply be a reflection of external factors such as the competitive environment, or the lack of incentives, or even the presence of negative incentives. There's one final barrier to creativity that I should also mention: the influence of context on creativity. Context is the external environment in which you operate. And let me talk about two aspects of this: culture and policies. Culture can be seen in the learned behavior patterns that are characteristic of an organization or social group. Group culture is influenced by the communication patterns, the levels of trust, and the diversity of group members, as well as the attitude to risk. Culture is influenced by history and experience and leadership. And with any group, there are explicit or implicit rules, policies, and procedures that have a direct impact on behaviors, and thus impact group creativity. Many of these policies were designed to minimize risk and protect the organization. However, in the world of creativity, this bureaucracy can stifle creativity and stop things from happening. Care needs to be taken when designing such policies that they don't have unintended consequences that stifle creativity. And existing policies and rules often need to be re-examined to look for these circumstances. I've mentioned that awareness of these barriers is the first step in addressing them. I also think The other critical element in addressing them is developing a high level of personal confidence and a strong belief in yourself and your ideas. David Kelly suggests the following.
So I've been looking at this kind of fear of judgment that we have, that you don't do things, you're afraid you're going to be judged. If you don't, say the right creative thing, you're going to be judged. And I had a major breakthrough when I met the psychologist, Albert Bandura. I don't know if you know Albert Bandura, but if you go to Wikipedia, it says that he's the 4th most important psychologist in history. Like Freud, Skinner, somebody in Bandura. Bandura is 86 and he still works at Stanford. And so I went to see him because he's just worked on phobias for a long time, which I'm very interested in. He had developed this kind of methodology that ended up curing people in a very short amount of time. Like in 4 hours, he had a huge cure rate of people who had phobias. And we talked about snakes. I don't know why we talked about snakes. We talked about snakes and fear of snakes as a phobia. He told me that he'd invite the test subject in and he'd say, there's a snake in the next room and we're going to go in there. And to which he reported that most of them replied, hell no, I'm not going in there. Certainly if there's a snake in there. But Bandura has a kind of a step-by-step process that was super successful. So he'd take people to this like two-way mirror looking into the room where the snake was. And he'd get them comfortable with that. And then through a series of steps, he'd move them and they'd be standing in the doorway with the door open and they'd be looking in there and he'd get them comfortable with that. And then many more steps later, kind of baby steps, they'd be in the room, they'd have like a leather glove, like a welder's glove on, and they'd eventually touch the snake. And when they touched the snake, everything was fine. They were cured. In fact, everything was better than fine. These people who had lifelong fears of snakes were saying things like, look how beautiful that snake is. And they were holding it in their laps, right? Bandura calls this process guided mastery. I love that term, guided mastery, right? And something else happened. These people who went through the process and touched the snake ended up having less anxiety about other things in their lives, right? They tried harder, they persevered longer, and they were more resilient in the face of failure, right? They just gained a new confidence. And Bandura calls that confidence self-efficacy, right? The sense that you can change the world and that you can attain what you set out to do.
Clearly, confidence builds over time. It's a function of your personality, the context in which you work or play, and the feedback you get from previous actions. Building your own self-confidence can be a key to success and often comes from reflecting on what you did and getting the right type of feedback from your friends and co-workers. On the website, we offer several resources to help with this. But one critical tool I'd like to mention is the idea of a learning journal, which is an opportunity for you to reflect, hopefully using the journal and reflecting on what you do by writing down your experiences will help with your confidence. In this lesson, we've talked about becoming more creative and about barriers to creativity. It's also important to recognize that you can facilitate creativity by removing some of those barriers for others, by changing your behaviors, or by changing the environment in which the creativity occurs.